In all the years that I've been involved with the March of the Living, I've had the distinct pleasure to know so many survivors because of their interest in helping to educate you. And one of our survivors who went with us on 6 marches passed away. He was coming on this march. He was supposed to be here. And there are people standing here with you that knew him very well. He became a personal friend of mine. He passed away suddenly. He had a very short illness, and in 3 weeks he was gone. And Jimmy Lichtman, when he traveled with us, suffered like many survivors suffered, but every survivor suffered differently. And every one of their family members who didn't make it, who were selected to go to the left, to the gas, a lot of survivors said they were the lucky ones. I've heard Jimmy say that. And Jimmy related the story on how he got here, and he was only here for a short period of time, and then he ended up at a camp called Mauthausen, which some of you might have heard of, which was as horrible as this camp is and many other camps we're going to visit. Mauthausen was among the worst there was. And he survived that. And he and many of the survivors that I have the pleasure of knowing have shared their stories and the way, by chance or by luck or by design, that they survived. And they talk about a word. And they talk about a word called suffering. Suffering. And as I continued being involved with the March of the Living, and as I continued making friends with our survivors and coming to love them and respect them and just admire the courage that they have and that they had, but they continue to have being with us, I remember my friend Jimmy Lichtman, who talked about that word suffering often. And yet, here's a guy that survived the Shoah. He lived life to the fullest. Jimmy, in his bravery, decided, I'm going to live, even though he lost all his family, except for one person. He made that decision. So what I'd like to do is let's all go into where this was Jimmy's barrack. So we're going to go inside, and I want to tell you a little bit of Jimmy's story inside. Jimmy was on a train that was part of the Hungarian transports in 1944. Most of this camp was built to take care of the Hungarian Jews and then the rest of the world. And they were transported to the tune of close to 450,000 Jews. Mostly here because the crematoria you're going to see today were designed for them. There was a selection done. His mother and a few others were selected from his family. They went to the gas. So Jimmy ended up in here with his 60 schoolmates and cousins and his father. These barracks were here, and these beds were here. 3 to 4 to 5 people, sometimes more, for the beds. When he got here with his family and his friends, there was no room. There was no room in any other barracks. They ended up in here. And his father and him were standing right where I'm standing. And Jimmy used to tell us the story of how for 3 weeks he would have to stand. They would have to sleep with all these people crowded in together. You think you're crowded in here now? They were all crowded together. And he said his father held on to this actual ring that I am holding on to hold him up. And Jimmy stood next to his father and kept him alive. And 3 weeks later, they survived this hell in this building. And they were transported to Mauthausen. And Jimmy stood by his father until the end. And the end was in Mauthausen. It happened to Jimmy's father, that Jimmy was standing next to him, and randomly he picked Jimmy, his father, and he said, "You get in the can." And Jimmy wanted to get into the can for his father, and he couldn't do it and his father was pushing the can. His father was killed in front of him, and Jimmy was crying a cry that I cannot imagine. I can't even come close to it. And he watched his father murdered in front of him by this capo. And the capo looked at him and said, "If you don't stop, you're next." And Jimmy stopped crying. He stopped crying. And he says, "That's how I survived." Among many other ways that he survived. He was going to be here with us. He was going to be standing here right at this moment talking to you and telling you this story and more. And I happened to be there the day before he passed away. I was on the side of his bed, and I held his hand, and he was in and out of understanding who was there. And when I started talking to him about things we did on the March of the Living, he perked up. Many of you have seen people at the end of their lives. He perked up, he listened, he smiled, he nodded. Because to him, this was a sacred duty to be here. He thought about his father every day, thought about his family he lost every day. And yet he continued in his life in the United States, as so many survivors did, continued, built a new life. And when he heard about the March of the Living 11 or 12 years ago, he had to do it. He had to do it. He needed to be here to be with you and to share his stories. Even though he suffered through every moment, when he closed his eyes and told that story, when the tears rolled down his eyes, he was watching the movie of his life and describing it to you. We have a lot of things we're going to be doing special on this March of the Living, but personally and professionally, I dedicate this March of the Living to Jimmy Lichtman.
You know, it's not getting easier for me to speak. In fact, it's very hard. It's almost impossible. And this is the 6th time I'm coming here, and each time I say to myself, I have to behave myself, I have to be strong, because your generation has to know for the future what had happened and to see to it that should not happen. So we were here about 3 weeks. All of a sudden, they said, okay, we're going to go. So they put us back in a cattle wagon with my father and the whole family, everybody, and we went 3 days. We arrived to Austria, a German concentration camp called Mauthausen. Now mind you, Auschwitz, we called it, it was a Vernichtungslager. What it means, mostly in Auschwitz, they selected you to work and to die, either one or the other one. Mauthausen, it is one of the worst concentration camps. Why? Because the German government leased us out to companies like Mercedes, BMW, Siemens, and Leica. They leased us out, and what the idea has been to kill us by not giving us food, but work us to death. People were dying by the hundreds. We came home from work, and we came home, we got very little food, very little food. All of a sudden, the officer came there, asked him, how many did you kill today? He said, whatever, 10, 5, not enough. Then he says, you. It was a drum outside, it was water and chlorine. So then they picked 2 guys and picked up that poor innocent guy and suffocated in the water. How many did you kill? Not enough. Then you. One was my father. He has to get undressed and beat him with a 2x4 till my father died in front of me. Before he died, the last moment, so we had gotten a piece of bread every 3rd day, like a 2x2. Before he died, he held his hand towards me, tried to give me that piece of bread, and he didn't make it anymore. And that was the end. And I started to scream and cry. And the capo said, if you say one more word, you're next. So I had to keep my mouth shut. So that was the end of my father. They burned it in the crematorium in Curzon, where now I have a plaque there from my father. And to him, it was double solace, because to see the pain that what I went through and what he went through, it was hell of hell. And I always say, why me? Why me? And every single night I say, why me? Why I am the one who is alive? It is not justice to see all those young children, you know, the whole school, the whole generation. It hurts. But I'm doing this here because I know I could do some good for the future generation.